So good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to each of you. My name is Evaleen Jaager Roy, and I'm the chair of the advisory board at SFU's Beedie School of Business, and I'm just delighted to be your host and moderator today. Before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. I encourage all of us to take a moment to reflect on our collective responsibility for reconciliation. So thank you for being here. It's wonderful to see so many of you, friends of Jack Austin's and friends of SFU alike. I'm thrilled to welcome you to what's going to be a very fun and engaging afternoon as we celebrate the launch of the Honorable Jack Austin's memoir, Unlikely Insider, a West Coast advocate in Ottawa. So we have the honor of hearing from Jack tonight as he shares his reflections on his remarkable career. And we are joined by a distinguished panel of wonderful people that I will be introducing very soon. But before we begin, it's my pleasure to introduce a very special guest for tonight's event. And now the special guest actually needs no introduction because we all know and love her. The Honorable Janet Austin, who, by the way, is no relation to the Honorable Jack Austin, but she's going to get into that, I understand, was sworn in as the 30th Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia in 2018. Prior to this appointment, she was CEO of the YWCA Metro Vancouver, one of the province's largest and most diversified nonprofits. She has served on multiple boards, and she works tirelessly across this province to connect communities and people. Her honor is Chancellor of the Order of British Columbia and was invested as a member of the Order in 2016. As Lieutenant Governor, she has identified 3 key themes for her mandate: the promotion of diversity and inclusion, democracy and civic engagement, and reconciliation. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to the Lieutenant Governor.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Evaleen, for your, I'll say, characteristically kind introduction. And good evening, everyone. I, too, would like to acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, upon whose traditional territory we gather today, and to thank them for sharing these lands in peace and friendship. Which is good evening, dear friends. It's wonderful to be among you today, and I do mean that so very sincerely. And I am truly delighted to be here to celebrate the launch of Jack's new book, Unlikely Insider, the most recent in a very long list of his accomplishments. But before we begin, I want to address a matter that has been a source of confusion ever since I moved to BC some 35 years ago. Confusion that persists to this day. For example, a few weeks ago, I met with colleagues at Government House to review our running list of Lieutenant Governor invitations and was advised that my calendar had been adjusted to enable my attendance at my brother's event. Well, I thought, I didn't know Charles was having an event, but happy to attend. Well, no, Your Honor, it's not Charles, it's your brother Jack. It's his book launch. So even there. Well, of course, I was just as delighted as I would have been if my brother had actually written a book to be here. But you see the problem. And this sort of thing has been happening to me ever since I arrived in BC. For 35 years, I've been living in the shadow of Jack Austin. And it's still going on. And I'm not making this up. I get periodic calls looking for the famous and distinguished Jack, and even the odd piece of mail. Well, I realized very quickly that my personal stature was greatly enhanced by this supposed familial connection. And I admit it's been tempting just to go with it. But honesty has prevailed, and I have bravely endured the looks of disappointment from those who were hoping to achieve 2 degrees of separation from the celebrated Jack. Well, imagine my delight when I actually met Jack Austin himself and found myself in a wonderful discussion group with him, and now can claim the privilege of friendship. And although I cannot claim a relationship by blood, I can say that Jack and I are related in another very important way, and that is by a shared passion for public policy and an abiding respect for each other's work. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Jack. He is the one who needs no introduction, but I'll give him one anyway. Jack Austin is a man of great integrity and wisdom, an exemplar of public service in every possible respect. He is a giant in the world of Canadian politics, a man who came from the West Coast, shook up the political scene in Ottawa, and put BC on the map. The old Chinese proverb, "The mountains are high and the emperor is far away," has some relevance for us here in BC, as our distance from the centre has enabled us to develop an external orientation. Early on, Jack understood the strategic and economic importance of our location as the gateway to the Pacific, and he saw that the economic centre of the country would inevitably shift west. BC today is a province of cosmopolitan modernists, globalists, and innovators, oriented to the future. But we remain anchored by our history as a separate British colony that negotiated its entry into Confederation by extracting a promise from Canada to build a transcontinental railway, thereby unifying and defining the country. Jack is also celebrated as a vigorous contributor in the Senate, a thoughtful voice on its evolution and its potential. Similarly, his impact on Canada-US-Mexico relations has been profound, to say the least. He has been instrumental in shaping so many aspects of our social and economic policy, our orientation to social justice, and our embrace of diversity and progress towards inclusion. Jack is also a proud champion of our professional, nonpartisan public service, and we need to add our voices to his in this respect, as well as a powerful advocate for engagement in civil society. As we look around the world today, we find ourselves increasingly concerned about the fragility of democracy, about the decline of trust in democratic conventions and public institutions, and about the erosion of civility in public and political discourse. Sadly, we're forced to confront the unassailable truth that even the most seemingly stable of societies can be subject to authoritarian capture. In this increasingly fractious world, Jack's vision and voice are more critical than ever. We hear a lot today about polarization, as we should. But the challenges of polarization will not be addressed by striving for uniformity of opinion. Rather, a thriving democracy requires a robust but respectful exchange of different ideas and perspectives. If anchored in trust, democracy can provide opportunities for everyone to participate and allow people who disagree to share power. Canada is not a perfect country, and we have work to do in many areas. But Jack reminds us that we can be, indeed we must be, more than individual actors engaged in pursuits that serve our own self-interest, but rather citizens who share responsibility for each other, for our country, and for the planet, and must act accordingly. He reminds us of the responsibility we all share to build the trust that, in his words, is the glue that holds our society together. And so, to my very near name twin, I just want to say thank you. Thank you, Jack, for being an inspiration to Canadians and for being an inspiration to me. And congratulations on the launch of Unlikely Insider. And I've brought my book with me for you to sign. All the very best, and enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Your Honor, for those very inspirational words and wise words. And thank you always also for your uplifting energy and presence. We're just so happy that you're with us here tonight. So I'm now going to introduce the other Austin in the room, since there's the two famous honorable Austins here. As Her Honor has said, Jack Austin is simply remarkable. There's nobody else that we can think of that has advised and worked with 5 of Canada's prime ministers, beginning with Lester Pearson, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Jean Chrétien, John Turner, and Paul Martin. What a record that is. He's also one of the longest-serving senators upon his Senate retirement in Canadian history, with 32 years of service. Jack is so well respected and has dedicated his long career of over 50 years to public service. And as our honor has said, he's so passionate about the story of Canada, but he actually is part of the story of Canada. He shaped Canada's history. He was also so well ahead of his time on so many aspects, including diversity, inclusion, and First Nations rights. Born in Calgary, Alberta, Jack started his career as a lawyer, but then grew into so many other roles: a civil servant, a politician, Deputy Minister of Energy, Mines and Resources, Chief of Staff to Trudeau, a federal cabinet minister 2 or 3 times over, and then senator. He was a powerful change agent in so many ways and connected Ottawa and BC as no one has before and no one since. Jack is one of the key reasons even that our Expo 86 happened in Vancouver, and I do hope that he might tell a bit of that story here today. During his distinguished career, he put BC on the map, working relentlessly for BC's interests in Ottawa. And along the way, he built and led several law firms. Today, Jack's an honorary professor and senior fellow at the Institute of Asian Research at UBC. And here at SFU, we have the Jack Austin Centre for Asia-Pacific Business Studies. Jack has been recognized with both an OBC and Order of Canada. So Jack's amazing life story needed to be told because it captures a whole era of Canada's history. And actually, we are so grateful to his daughter, Edie, whom Jack will introduce later. And Edie, there you are. There's Edie, co-author of this lovely book. And what I understand from Jack is that Edie basically said, "Look, Dad, either you write it or I will." So thank you, Edie. We're so grateful that you co-authored and helped get everything on paper. And I just want to add on a personal note that Jack and I have been friends for almost 30 years now. We met through the wonderful late John MacArthur, who was a Burnaby local, who became Dean of the Harvard Business School. So Jack, you've been such a wonderful friend and supporter for all those years, and I'm just so happy to be here for you today. So we're going to hear a lot from Jack in just a few minutes, but before we do, I want to introduce these fabulous panelists that we have tonight, all of whom are passionate about Canada and also Canada's role in the Asia-Pacific region. So first of all, we have Paul Evans, Professor of Asian and Trans-Pacific International Relations at UBC. Paul has been promoting the construction of multilateral institutions since 1988. In 2021, Paul was appointed the HSBC Chair in Asian Research at UBC. He's been a co-founder of the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia-Pacific, the Canadian Consortium on Human Security, and the Canada-Korea Forum, amongst so many other things. It would take me quite a long time to go through everything that Paul has done, but welcome, Paul. We're so happy to have you. Next, we have Sarah Kutulakos, hope I said that okay, who is the Executive Director of the Canada-China Business Council. And Sarah joined the council in 2007, revitalizing its role as one of Canada's top bilateral trade and investment organizations. With broad emerging market business experience, Sarah has been involved in the Greater China region since the late 1980s, when she worked in Taiwan and gained a deep understanding of China and Chinese business practice. Welcome, Sarah. Next, we have Jeff Nankivell, President and CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Welcome, Jeff. Jeff joined the foundation in 2021 after a 33-year career in Canada's Foreign Service. He served in various positions at the Canadian International Development Agency and held 3 postings to Canada's embassy in Beijing. Jeff was later appointed Consul General of Canada in Hong Kong and Macau, where he served until 2021. So welcome, Jeff. And last, but certainly not least, we have Jing Li, co-director of SFU's Jack Austin Centre for Asia-Pacific Business Studies. Jing Li is a professor of international business and also Canada Research Chair in Global Investment Strategy, in addition to being the director of the Jack Austin Centre. So welcome, Jing. Please help me warmly welcome the panelists. Now, I get to get right next to Jack here and ask him a few questions. So, Jack, this won't hurt a bit. This will be fun. I wanted to kick off with a couple of human interest questions, Jack, because your book is so fascinating in so many ways. And tell so many stories of all the various things that you have done. But I wanted to start, first of all, with a big congratulations. And I'm going to say that Jack allowed me to say this. It's amazing for you to have a book launch at the age of 91 going on 71. How amazing is that? So I wanted to ask you, Jack, how does it feel?
How does it feel? You know, I feel kind of numb with what I've just heard. Is that really me? Did I die? But my real reaction is to answer your question by saying that I rediscovered my passions for Canada in the writing of the book with my daughter, Edie. I had put everything away when I left Ottawa in 07. I had other challenges. There was a transition to private life. Those are very different challenges than the ones that you face when you're dealing with public policy and government. And I sort of put it all in the the back closet for a while, but it kept coming back. And as public issues changed in this country, and changed in some ways that I didn't appreciate, I really had a quite negative reaction to certain events that were taking place. I thought, well, there is a story I could tell. And then I have to add the huge number, by my count, 20 people who kept asking me when I was going to write. And my daughter, Edie, of course, as you've heard, said, I'm going to write it if you don't. And I thought, well, I'd better respond. And there are people on the stage talk to me about it. Paul Evans kept harassing me about it out at UBC. Almost every meeting we had, have you started the book yet? So it is, I feel that I've accomplished a story that needs telling. That's how I really feel. But while I have the mic, and I'll tell you, I was once leader of the Senate of Canada, and that allowed me the ability to talk with no time limit. That was in the Senate, of course.
Oh dear.
But I do want to thank Her Honor for her remarks and for attending here. Janet and I have a very similar view of public policy, social policy, progressive issues. We've chatted about it over the years. We've belonged to a same discussion group, and I've heard her views, she's heard mine. They're very compatible. We get along wonderfully. Probably get along far better that we're not related. I want to thank SFU for holding this event. It's such a generous gesture on the part of SFU. And Evaleen, thank you for your role here and so many others that are supporting your role here. I have to mention Kavita, who's sitting in this front row, who's being the chief administrator for organizing this particular event. I will tell you that she probably got 5, 6, or 7 emails from me every day. So thank you so much. There's so many people that I've known who are in this audience for so many years. I know so many people personally. I've worked with a great many of you in one role or another. If I start mentioning names, I would abuse the greatest principle of political smartness. And that is, if you can't mention everybody, don't mention anybody. And it's too much to mention everybody. If I could, which I doubt I can. So thank you so much for the first question. I'm sorry I wandered.
Okay, that's such a wonderful answer, and we'll move to the second one. So Jack, we talked about this from the late wonderful Queen Elizabeth II to Nelson Mandela to Pierre Trudeau to Henry Kissinger and many, many more. You've met and worked alongside so many amazing world leaders. Do you have a particular story about any of them that stands out in your memory that you might want to share?
Well, I guess I would have to say that it's very hard to tell a story about Pierre Trudeau. He wasn't the kind of person who created stories that you could tell. And I know he's watching me. But I will say that I have a favorite story. I mention it in the book, and you see the cover of the book. That cover comes from the inauguration of the construction of Canada Place on March 9th, 1983. And that picture was taken with Pierre Trudeau, myself, and Her Majesty at the moment when the construction was inaugurated by the pour of concrete. So everybody's excited. We finally got this thing going. The Queen arrived on the Britannia actually in Victoria 2 days earlier. And I met the Queen there as the Minister in Attendance. This is a phrase that's used in Royal Protocol. Minister in Attendance, when Her Majesty goes anywhere outside of her home, there has to be a minister available because she can only direct her requests or her needs through a Privy Councillor. And so when the Queen was traveling in Canada, I was a few times a Minister in Attendance. Got to know her quite well, but on this particular occasion, was my first one-on-one with Her Majesty. We were at a banquet in the Empress Hotel in Victoria, and we sat down, and after I proposed the royal toast, and people were settled in their chairs, Her Majesty turned to me and said, "Senator Austin, what do you know about horses?" And I said, "Your Majesty, I know absolutely nothing about horses." I was tempted to say I rode a Shetland pony once. And then she said, "What do you know about dogs?" And I said, again, I know absolutely nothing about dogs. And here was a slight panic. Yeah. You know, she would have to turn to Bill Bennett to talk to him. So I said, "But you know, Your Majesty, I've studied British history. I was a history major and an economics major at UBC. I studied British history, and I can talk to you about British history." And she said, "Well, how do you approach British history?" And I said, "Well, I'm fond of asking my daughters when they're young, but other people when I'm able to raise the subject, right?" Yeah. You are descended from Elizabeth I, correct? That's the question, not to her, of course. Yeah. And she said, "What answer do you get?" I said, 75% people say yes. "And do you know the answer?" And I said, "Yes, I happen to." And the short story is that Queen Elizabeth II is descended from Mary, Queen of Scots. And nobody knows that, except she does. And I happen to. So then we got into maybe a 10-minute conversation. Because her next question was, "What do you know about the Hanoverians?" And I know a lot about the Hanoverians, so I won't tell you the rest of the story. But she's a delightful person, charming, but highly intelligent, was, of course, now deceased, but highly intelligent, unbelievably well briefed on Canada. Mm-hmm. Really, I would say in the top 1,000 people who know the country or knew the country. So that's one way to answer your question.
Thank you. That's such an interesting story. I love that. I'm just going to ask one more quick one. So what's so great in the book is that you're so modest and you say somehow that you never thought of yourself as a change agent, and yet you shaped and changed so much. And one quote I loved in the book was that Vancouver is 3,000 miles from Ottawa, but Ottawa is 30,000 miles from Vancouver. Out of all of that, is there any one thing that kind of stands out for you of all the things that you were involved in and accomplished, or anything that you were most proud of?
Well, your question leads me to talk a little bit about federal-provincial relations, if I may. Of course, that's not my quote. That quote goes back into time immemorial in British Columbia history, but a mayor of Vancouver who became a senator in the 1930s, Jerry McGeer, used that quote and made it popular, and it's been attributed to him ever since. And of course, the history of British Columbia in Canada from Confederation was one of distance and difference on the part of central Canada, sense of alienation, and down through the years, political parties of every stripe, including Liberal, would attack the feds in order to get themselves elected. It was a popular way to denounce the feds and say how important they were in opposing federal this and federal that. And that's the politics I was born into when I became a Liberal in this province. And I became a Liberal in 1958. It was the perfect time to become a Liberal. The W.C. Bennett government was bestride the province and was not going anywhere. It was very powerful. And John Diefenbaker just got elected. So why not join the Liberal Party? Anyway, the province, when I came through the misfortune of the federal government not electing any MPs in 1980, and therefore Mr. Trudeau turned to Ray Perot and myself as the representatives of British Columbia, 2 senators, which is conventional. It's happened many times. Expo 86 was on the front row of British Columbia priorities, provincial government priorities. And the provincial government was attacking the federal government for indifference. And indeed, the federal government of Pierre Trudeau was indifferent towards it, even hostile. I mean, I can tell you, and I say it in the book, a lot of cabinet ministers from everywhere else in Canada were opposed to it. They wanted the money for their purposes that should go to Expo 86. BC was in a deep depression, and I had econometric work done that demonstrated that pump priming it's a phrase that's gone away from use now, but we used it then. We needed a heavy injection of federal money into the BC economy, and it turned out that Expo 86 was perfect. So what turned, I went to Bill Bennett and I laid the case out for him, and he and I negotiated, in short story, negotiated a federal provincial agreement. I then had to sell it. And I was turned down by every cabinet committee meeting that I went to. Finally, in the way the federal government worked, the final decision had to be taken by the executive committee of cabinet, which was called Priorities and Planning. Prime Minister chaired that meeting. And it was argued out and opposed, and the Prime Minister, instead of going with the consensus, simply said, "I'm going to adjourn the item," and invited me to come and talk to him. And I had to talk with him. He didn't respond to me in any way. He just stayed silent. I thank you very much for your point of view. Out I went. I had no idea whether I would ever be a useful person for British Columbia, because without Expo 86, I would have had no authority, no credibility. So at the next P&P meeting, when the item came up, Pierre Trudeau simply said, "I've decided we'll go forward with the participation with BC. Jack will become the federal minister for Expo 86. He'll be in charge of Canada, building Canada Place." And I was elated and astonished. And my cabinet colleagues were astonished, but not elated.
Oh, isn't that a remarkable piece of history? Thank you, Jack. Wow, that was a great story. I'm now going to open it up to our panel, and we'll ask each of you just to ask one question. Perhaps, Paul, can I start with you? And then we'll move our way this way, and then we'll open it up once everyone's had a chance.
Now I'm frightened.
This is not a comprehensive examination. But, Jack, what an honor it is to be here and celebrate a book that's come out. And it's kind of a nice occasion because we're here to praise Caesar, not to bury him. And to watch this book in construction has been a great privilege. And it's also been an education. And I suspect we're going to be talking about your involvement as a policy shaper and maker domestically, also internationally, and China and other things which have been our mutual interest. But I had an earlier puzzle. Jack Austin and Paul Evans were both born in a place called Calgary, Alberta. And it takes a great jump of imagination to become a good Canadian and a good British Columbian coming out of where you came from. And as I read the book, and I was wondering, how did you get this dual identity? You function perfectly in Ottawa. You function remarkably well here. How did you connect the two? And I puzzled through it. And I think the answer came to me coming back from the airport last week when I went across the Arthur Lang Bridge. And your early political life, when you probably didn't know much about this province, when you probably didn't know much about the politics of Ottawa, except as seen through a telescope. Who was this guy, Arthur Lang, and what did he mean to you?
That is such a wonderful question, and it comes without any notice to me. And it is, he was my first political mentor and teacher. And Art was a wonderful British Columbian, born on Sea Island, of Presbyterian folks. And I have to tell a story that it is in the book, but I heard it in almost every speech he gave. And the story was that he was a young lad of about 5 and Presbyterian, and they had no minister. And so they had itinerant ministers, and he was there with his parents in the church, and this itinerant Presbyterian minister said to the congregation, "And if you sin, you'll drown in hellfire and brimstone. And you can call out, 'I dinna ken, I dinna ken,' and the Lord will answer you. You'll say, 'You ken new.'" Okay, and that means now. You understand now, right? Right. And he'd tell the story, and then he would talk about how wrong that attitude was, and that it was living together with people is caring and compassion. It's all about caring and compassion. And so I became his executive assistant. It would take too long to explain how that happened, but he invited me down to Ottawa to be his executive assistant. He had the Department of Northern Affairs and National Resources, it was then called the North. And he was a passionate builder of Canada. I say in the book, Art and W.C. Bennett were huge opponents and adversaries. And Bennett extinguished Art Lang's career in the legislature, defeated him, and he was gone. But they were actually had very much the same approach to the development of British Columbia, the building of British Columbia infrastructure, and developed the province in depth. But I traveled with Art all over the province for almost 3 years in every community and watched this person who knew the history of British Columbia back to his youth, the premiers back to his youth. And I learned from British Columbia history. I learned the relationship of British Columbia to Canada, or the lack of a positive relationship. And I met the people that he knew, a bank manager in Pouce Coupé, or Valemont, or First Nations people in the Chilcotin. I mean, it was a profound education going with Art through the province. And he was an Aggie graduate from UBC, agriculture, and was the manager of a company called Buckerfields, which sold agricultural implements and seeds and so on to the agricultural industry. And so he knew everybody in farming, he knew everybody in the community, and I am the fantastic beneficiary of that man's knowledge and of his approach.
Thank you. Great question. Sarah.
Well, it's an honor to be here for me as well. And back in 2020, excuse me, at the Canada-China Business Council, we were looking at the 50th anniversary of Canada-China relations. And I came up with an awards program that we would use to recognize individuals, because we looked at, over those 50 years, all the progress that had been made had really been done with the efforts of individuals and institutions. But we came up with something I called the 5 at 50, where we recognize people in 5 categories. And Jack was the only person to be nominated by 2 people in our relationship builder category. One of them, Don Campbell, started his nomination by saying, Jack Austin stands as a towering figure in the history of the Canada-China relationship over the past 50 years. And then the other, Yves Tiberghien of UBC, concluded his by saying that the Honorable Jack Austin is likely the longest serving person in both public and private life in building Canada's modern relationship to China. And given that the judges could only do one thing, which was to create a special category and give it all to Jack, so he was the Outstanding Achievement winner. And there was so much in that relationship between Canada and China that took a lot of courage at multiple points in the relationship. And you say in the book that Canada maintained Trudeau's belief that come what may, China was a major player in the global system, and Canada had to have a relationship with China. And I don't feel like our current government has much of a relationship at the moment. What do you think, Jack, it would take today for our government to make a decision to engage productively, to approach China with cognitive empathy, and whether that, what it would take would be institutional or by a person? What will it take, and how long?
Well, my first reaction is, wow. It's a terrific question, and it doesn't have a clear-cut answer. But first of all, we are a democracy, and governments cannot get out too far ahead of the population itself. And so where are Canadians today on China? They're very negative about China. And the Meng Wanzhou and Two Michaels issue is burned very clearly in the minds of Canadians, and it signals a behavioral pattern on the part of the Chinese that attacks all our sense of natural justice and human values. So you've put the first part of the issue clearly, Pierre Trudeau. China is there. And he went on to say in 1968, as he became prime minister, that there are going to be very few global problems that can be solved without the participation of China. And that's as real today as it ever was in his time. And so we see two major difficulties. One is that and this one is sort of superficial, but there are forces in our country and forces in the United States that are driving a kind of mob attitude towards negativity of China, negativity with relationship. There's a bipolar contest, American exceptionalism, the dominance of America, the superpower America trying to maintain its power as the unipolar country in the world. China's rise is a reality. America has benefited enormously economically from China's rise, and China's benefited enormously from America's market and technology. And so the demonstration of the facts is that these two countries need one another. Their stability, their economic stability and their growth depends on one another. And I would say, if I may, as a parenthesis, I'm really puzzled about China's leaning towards Russia, because it's not in its political or economic interests that I can see. There must be something there, or because the Chinese are not stupid people. They're very wise people. They know what, they think a lot about their issues. But coming back to the main theme, and I'm sorry to go on so long, but the reality underneath the surface is that the process, the relationship will, I hope, be a process of, as Churchill is alleged to have said, jaw instead of war. There's no clear way as to how we're going to get along except to meet every day, to have as much interaction as we can with people at a people-to-people level, to educate their students in our universities, to have our students educated in their universities, to try to rebuild a level of trust between the two countries. China takes offense very easily. We've seen that in its policies. It still feels that somehow it's a society that's been set upon by colonialism. And of course, they were invaded by Japan. They were invaded by Russia. Who remembers that anymore? They feel insecure. And one of the greatest issues in Chinese governance is the security of its borders. And so what we're seeing is their extension of their borders well into the South China Sea, which is an offense to international trade and commerce, to the freedom of navigation, and so on and so on. So I'm just throwing a lot of stuff up against the wall. It's a very complicated relationship today. And I just want to end this by saying that Canada is, in my view, failing to distinguish between the needs of a superpower, the United States, and our own needs as a separate sovereignty. We are a separate sovereignty. We have our own interests. They're not superpower interests. Yes, they are, and they're not. We've been pretty good about distancing when we can without a U.S. reaction that's too punishing. Right? And I'm going to say one thing that I shouldn't say, and that is, but I'm 91, so what the heck? We have being driven, and the Americans even more, by a messianic culture, that we are a superior society, that Christian civilization is a superior civilization. And that went a long way when we had the money and the technology and other countries didn't. All right, but today they have technology, they have money, and they don't like the message that they're somehow less than we are. And that's not a good basis for a foreign policy on our part or anybody's part, as far as I'm concerned. And what's happened is that that messianic culture has shape-shifted, to use a word, into a political culture. So in the American system, America's superior, no longer because of the religious background, but because of who they are and what they've accomplished and so on. Leading thinkers in America and Britain and Canada and so on have said the two ideas have to be separated. The idea of moral values and the idea of pragmatic relationship, war avoidance, economic growth, these ideas have to be separated. You have to live with your values, but you don't have to preach your values. You have to defend your values, but you don't have to preach your values. We do have to make a living in the world. Nobody's going to make a living for Canada but Canada. And that's an Art Lang expression. And I'll borrow it. And I see Gordon Gibson here, or at least he was here. And Gordon succeeded me as Art Lang's executive assistant. And he would remember that phrase. Thank you for the question.
Jeff, over to you.
Wow, it's such an honor, I think, for all of us to be on this stage with you, Jack. And let me say, I'm a person who moved to Vancouver a year and a half ago to take up the role of president of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. I'm not the only person on this stage who has held that role. And it may sound odd, but I think it gives me something in common with you, Edie, which is that without Jack, neither of us would be here today. And I think it's very true for many of us in terms of where we are in our lives and what we've engaged in. You've touched so many of us, and I really am thrilled to have the opportunity to say on a public stage, to express my thanks to you, Jack, for the advice that you have given me. We first met in 1994 on the first Team Canada mission. I was on my first posting in Beijing at the embassy as a young officer with a full head of hair. And since I have come to Vancouver to the foundation, we have been meeting regularly, and you've been such an amazing mentor, and I'm looking forward to continuing that. Now, in terms of a question, there's so much that one could cover. I'm struck by the observation that, there are leaders in the history of our country since Confederation, and you've been around for more than half of it. We have had leaders who have been regional champions, and we have leaders who have been nation builders. But the list of leaders who have been both is very, very short. And Paul, not for the first time, Dr. Evans already went there in his question, but I want to come back to this idea about combining the regional championship role and the nation building role, because I think that's really one of the key messages of your amazing life story. And I have to say, the creation of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada as a national institution based here in British Columbia, possibly the first really federal kind of institution,
and
right?
still the only.
Yeah.
Headquartered.
Headquartered in British Columbia is really, an expression of that. There are some who would say that's your greatest achievement, but there's so many other achievements that have people to speak for them here. But my question is, at a time when we see a greater polarization in Canada on certain foreign policy issues, perhaps unprecedented. You can maybe speak to that, but and particularly on the issue of relations with China, but on some other aspects of foreign policy as well. You know, the role of subnational governments, the provinces, the cities, the institutions we have at the subnational level, which at times in our relationship, for example, with China, have acted as a kind of a pilot light, keeping things going. I remember a mission that you encouraged in 2008. Sarah and I worked on this. That was most of the premiers going to China at a time when the national government was not engaging. And I wonder if you see is there any potential, you know, for us to work ourselves out of this corner that we're in as a nation on this issue by going through the roads that go through the provinces and the cities? And is there a way for us to be doing nation building in our engagement with Asia more broadly as a national project for Canada in this decade and the decades to come? There seems to be some momentum at the moment behind that idea, and we're delighted to be a part of it. And I think it's the coming to fruition of a vision that you had a long time ago. Is there a way that we can kind of bring people together around a national project, but by going through a route that goes through local organizations?
It has to happen in that way amongst other ways. And one of my passions for helping create the Asia Pacific Foundation and keeping it an important player in Canadian affairs is, quite frankly, that its mission is national, but its clients are everyone who's interested, cities, provinces. We have, it's been a puzzle to me, quite frankly, that the provinces have, with huge economic interests in China trade, right, have been very silent about Canada's relationship. Cities, Vancouver's had historically been quite active on its own account in China and Asia. What I found in politics, I mean, one of the profound lessons of politics is that the people who benefit from policy are silent. The people who see themselves as harmed are noisy, right? And so the silent people want the politicians to pay the price for change, and politicians are sometimes noticeably careful to sidestep those issues, so nothing happens, right? And so BC is a bit of an exception, but BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba are major trade provinces with China. Do we hear anything from them in terms of today's relationship with China, or what is in the national interest or their provincial interest? There are farm organizations, beef exporters, pork exporters, pulse exporters. You know the list far better than I. Do they say anything? No. They just all stay back and say, oh, well, the federal government, it's the federal government that has to do it, right? And the federal government, this is a circular argument, but the federal government then says, but if the constituency won't lean into supporting us, we don't have, in a democracy, we don't have the authority to make policy changes, right? The public doesn't support it. So this is one of the dilemma of our issue. But Asia, everybody here knows the statistics in terms of 60% of the world's population, 40% of its GDP and growing. China growing at maybe 5% GDP. the US growing at 2.4, half as much. Canada, 2.1, 1.7, whatever, depending on who you read. Our well-being is going to depend in remaining one of the world's great exporters, one of the great traders. We're second to Germany in our dependence on international trade. And there again is an argument for being realistic about China. But you've put your finger, Jeff, on a very important part of the political dynamic. And maybe somebody should put a fire under these guys.
Thank you. Jing.
Thank you. I'm really honored and thrilled to be part of this panel. Jack, first, congratulations on the very exceptional book. It's really a treasure for lots of us here. And I think it's a must read for anyone interested in Canadian history, policy making, business, law, Indigenous engagement, international relations, or simply just the joys of international travel. My question to you is about the Canadian resource sector. So you have had extensive experiences in this sector, both as a lawyer and as Deputy Minister of the Energy, Mines and Resources. So I'm interested in hearing about your thoughts on Canada's current critical mineral strategy. So this strategy positions critical minerals as a key opportunity for Canada's economy, workers, and net zero future. And Canada aims to build a nationally integrated value chains for critical minerals, from mining to manufacturing to recycling. So what do you think are the implications of this strategy for Canada's competitive advantages over the next 5 to 10 years? And also, in your opinion, what are the key factors that can ensure the success of this strategy?
Thank you for the chance to be upbeat. This is an exciting opportunity for Canada. We have the resources, and the world needs these resources. It will take time to explore, develop, refine, and make ourselves a critical minerals factor in the global system. But the opportunity is there. And we will need government policies shaping the tax system, shaping research, shaping incentives for Canadian companies to get going. One of the biggest resources is in Ontario, called the Ring of Fire. A lot of the problems with our resource potential is that it is in remote communities, remote parts of the country where there isn't transportation infrastructure or not effective transportation infrastructure. Another issue that stands in rapid development is dealing with our obligations to First Nations. And this is part of our life as a Canadian society, bringing about change, adding to the quality of everybody's life in the country. I'm not about to make a speech about First Nations, I could, but they are important players, and reconciliation is part of the Canadian fabric, and recognition part of the Canadian fabric. So bringing them on, giving them a role, showing where they fit in the Canadian system is part of what will challenge government. But I will say, in the upbeat part of this is that as we develop a global role as a critical minerals player, we develop our stature internationally. Believe it or not, it's about money. Power and money go together. When China had no money, it had little power. Today it has a lot of money, it has a lot of power. And Canada will be a more significant player in the global economy. And that has multiplier effects. It even makes Canadian diplomats offered 2 drinks instead of 1 at every reception. So, I'm excited by the potential for the policy, and hoping that it's not just a lot of rhetoric that doesn't have follow-through, because sometimes the political process, not just in our country, but sometimes the political process is ground by people who don't share the value system. I want to say I'm fascinated by the tech mining company situation currently, that the controlling shareholder is alleged to want tech to remain Canadian controlled. I haven't heard that from a Canadian business leader for a long time. And I don't know how long it'll last, but at least it's nice to see. Thank you, Jing.
Thank you. Well, we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions from the panel here, if there's anything burning on anyone's minds. Paul, I see you nodding.
I do, because a name was mentioned earlier, John MacArthur,
Yes.
who was a dear friend of many people in this room, and
Yes.
a pretty great Canadian who managed to live a life in the United States quite effectively to the advantage of both. And that idea of a Canadian champion company, or Canadian champion companies, he felt was really essential to us, that you pick up. Jack, but I would like to ask you about the United States, because many of the things you and federal governments have been able to do in past in the hemisphere, and with reference to China in particular, sometimes we took a little bit different path than our American friends. But if we look at the situation in the year 2023, the latitude for maneuver in Ottawa that would lean in a different direction than the United States, that room for maneuver is becoming smaller and smaller. Whatever the aspirations of a government, and in addition to a negative public, it's in an era of US-China competition defining the strategic world, and Americans expecting Canada and others to align with the United States. If you were in Ottawa at this stage, not just as a wise sage, but as a player, how would you handle the American factor now in relations with China? Where could Canada, is there room for any independent or somewhat independent policy?
There's, in the past, historically, particularly in Pearson's time, Canada played an international role as a good offices player. It served the purpose of getting in between disputants and helping mediate settlement. And that in the Middle East, people are familiar with that period, know how successful that was at that time. Sometimes that having a third party to talk to and not talking directly makes it a little easier to avoid embarrassment while negotiating. And Canada did play that role. The US doesn't want that role today. China doesn't want anyone to play that role today. The difficulty is that we're in a phase where both sides are seeking supporters around the globe. And, Canada, it isn't a question of Canada weighing whether to support China or the US. Canada is an ally of the US. We depend on them for security. We depend on them for our economic well-being. They're at 75% of our exports. But that doesn't mean that we are prepared to think only the way the Americans think. We have to think on our own as well. We have to think about our own interests. And the answer to your question is we have to keep flooding American think tanks, American politicians. In order for Canada to maintain its stability in the US, we have to have a big presence in the US all the time. And we have to tell our story to American business people, American media people, American politicians. We have to tell it all the time. And that's why our consulates in the United States are absolutely critical to us. We have to tell the story that for 36 states, Canada is their #1 export country. They sell to us, 36 states. They don't know that. They don't know that. And we're dealing with an American population that isn't well educated about international life, international issues. I mean, I don't mean to put the American public down, but there was a contest in which they were given a map of the states of the United States and asked to name all the states. And the average person got 17 right? And when you asked what to name the country on the northern border and the country on the southern border, the number was even lower in identifying the names of those countries. Very few Americans have passports, you know. So we're living with a country which is very inward-looking in its nature. It has an attitude of self-sufficiency, which has, in many ways, been justified. But times are changing, and it's not as justified as it used to be. And I want to say that at there is an echelon of American society which is at the top of every discipline in the world. Science, education, philosophy, medicine. So the Americans are at the top of the world game, but it's not the majority of Americans. And therefore, they're a democracy. They are driven by the opinions of the average American. And the average American has lived inside America most of the time, most of their lives. Lived inside their own states most of their lives. Don't travel that much. And so, I'm calling a spade a spade. I mean, it's very difficult when you're looking to make an impact on Americans. You can't do it retail. You have to Canadians have to be there and live in American society and tell the Canadian story every day.
So I'm just conscious of our time. I'd like to ask you, Jack, for just closing remarks. Is there a question that you wish we would have asked that you are ready to answer and are dying to answer, or would you just like to perhaps say a few words to all of us in closing from your end?
Well, first of all, I want to thank again all of you for being here and for listening to me. It's a great privilege for me to have this kind of audience, and I live in the belief that all of us care about Canada. We want a fair and equitable Canadian society, one that is socially progressive, but also economically stable, but politically free. And quite frankly, I think, and I've had, as you've said, traveled to a lot of the world in my day, this is the luckiest country in the world. We are the luckiest people in the world. We're 38 million people with the second largest geography in the world. We have 20% of the world's fresh water. Not always in the right place, but it's ours. Exactly. Yeah. It is ours, and we're envied for it. We're envied for having created a society of diversity that works. I was so disappointed in the New York Times about 3.5 months ago. They wrote an editorial in their magazine that said diversity is a failure as a governance model. And I thought, that idiot doesn't know anything about what's going on north of their border. Neither does his editorial board, obviously, because we have put together a society of global culture. If you look at our cabinet today federally, you look at provincial cabinets, people are elected from every culture. It's an open society. And we're learning to live together, and we're learning to live together with democratic values, with the idea that equality is a sincere and significant value system for us. I'm really proud of this country. I do, in the book, talk a great deal about the importance of Canadian public service, the people who work for government, the people who care. I've never, in all the work I've done with public servants, the vast, vast majority of them have cared about their work, have cared about achieving their tasks, have cared about caring about Canadians and serving Canadians. It's, as I say, we're a lucky country, but as I said before, nobody's going to make a living for us. We have to work, we have to be creative, we have to learn to get along as we are. If there's a tiny dark cloud on my horizon, it is the idea of a populism that sits on the other side of the border to a large extent, to the largest extent, but their media floods our country. And so everybody here, everybody in Canada, pays any attention to public affairs, absorbs American culture in some way. They assess it, they learn to live with it, they reject it, they accept it. But at the moment, we are seeing in Canadian politics, a pursuit for power for the sake of power, not for the sake of serving the public. And that is, if that grows, it will be very disappointing to me. It is something that I dwell on quite a lot. And I come back to the book, I come back to Edie, who made sure that I wrote with a conscience and checked every damn thing I said. She's a wonderful fact checker. She ended her career as editorial editor of the Montreal Gazette, editorial page editor of the Montreal Gazette. Just retired, finished the book and decided to retire. I finished the book and I'm not retiring. I don't believe in it. As long as I can stand up and do what I do, I'm very happy to continue doing that. But thank you, Edie, for what you've done. I have 3 daughters, and the other 2 are in the front row, and I'd just like them to stand, Sherry and Barbara. I will end by telling you I've been a very lucky person through my life. Good things have happened to me, and my 3 daughters are amongst the best. Oh.
Thank you so much. I wonder if we might give this wonderful treasure a standing ovation. May I ask that you join me in this? Jack, thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists. You were terrific. Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists. I did want to mention that for those of you that didn't get a copy of the book, it's available online. It's at Chapters Indigo. It's readily available. So book sales are always a great thing. So thank you to everybody. I do want to recognize again Kavita. Please stand up. And Gerardo. They organized today so beautifully. Thank you to the Beedie School of Business for hosting tonight, and thank you to each of you for being here. There's a reception. You're going to have lots of time to meet the panelists, to meet Jack, and to mix and mingle. Thank you very much.